The following episode was recorded in the afternoon of September 11th, soon after Louisiana completed its early September Teal survey, and also relatively soon after Hurricane Laura made landfall in southwestern Louisiana. In fact, both of these topics were the focus of discussion on this episode. As sometimes happens, we were unable to release this episode as quickly as we had hoped. In the meantime, Hurricane Sally emerged and made landfall on the northern Gulf of Mexico with significant effects on coastal portions of Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. Because of the timing of when we recorded this episode with Larry and when Hurricane Sally emerged and made landfall, there is no mention of Hurricane Sally in this episode. We nevertheless are aware of its significant impacts, and we send along our thoughts, prayers, and well wishes for everyone affected by it, and we hope for a speedy recovery. We are also aware that at the time of the release of this episode, there is yet another storm in the Gulf of Mexico for which many residents are preparing, and we similarly send along our thoughts and prayers to each of you that may be in its path. The information in the episode you're about to hear, we believe, nevertheless remains relevant, and we think it would be of interest to many of our listeners. We therefore are bringing it to you today. We thank you for listening to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, and we hope you enjoy today's episode.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
On recent episodes, we have had conversations that took us to the northern end of the flyway as we're here in early September. The waterfowl seasons are underway in Canada. Teal migration is well underway. So we've had some conversations with folks in South Dakota, in Manitoba, and we're going to have some conversations with folks in Saskatchewan a bit later on. Today, our conversation takes us to the other end of the flyway, all the way down to Louisiana, a very popular place to many of us that listen to this podcast. And we're going to be speaking with our good friend, frequent guest on the show, on the podcast, Larry Reynolds, Waterfowl Study Leader for Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, to talk about a couple of things. One is which will be the results of their recent September Teal survey, but we're also going to talk about something else that happened here recently. Specifically the impacts from Hurricane Laura. We're going to talk about that. But let me welcome in Larry to the podcast. Larry, thanks for joining us here to have this conversation.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you very much for the invite.
We're here in early September, a lot of stuff going on. This is normally the time of year when waterfowl hunters in coastal Louisiana are super excited about this first opportunity to get out in the marsh. They've looked forward to this all year long since the close of the waterfowl hunting season in January, anticipating this early teal season, which oftentimes is really good, really productive in Louisiana and some of the other Gulf states. This year is different. And you know, we've had instances like this in the past when we live on the Gulf Coast. We know that tropical storms are a fact of life. You've lived there a long time. I lived there for 14 years. And we, while we were there, went through several of these. But we had Hurricane Laura hit a couple of weeks ago, and that's where we want to start this conversation. We're going to get to the duck numbers here a bit later on, but we have to put things in perspective and realize that the impacts from Hurricane Laura were extensive. I know you were up in the air flying these surveys this past week, and we want to talk about that a little bit from the perspective of what you saw. But we know that that people in southwestern Louisiana continue to be affected by this, are going to be affected by this for a long time to come. But Larry, you having seen what has actually unfolded there with the landfall of Hurricane Laura, just talk about what you saw.
I don't really know the right word, Mike, but when you see the extent of damage of this kind, you're awestruck for a short period of time. The damage to structures, homes, camps, infrastructure that we depend on every day it's simply awesome when you see fields of metal debris from siding and roofs and those pieces of metal wrapped around trees that are still standing. Every single power line and telephone pole snapped off a few feet from the ground. Tremendous amounts of debris out in the marsh. My survey transects in southwest Louisiana extend from the coastline inland to about I-10. And so most of the communities that I fly over are the smaller communities. We touch just to the southern and western edge of Lake Charles, but there's no place in that extent from just east of the Texas border all the way to about the middle part of the state. There is some evident damage everywhere you go. And in a lot of places that are special to me personally because I hunt fairly close to there, the towns of Cameron, Creole, Grand Chenier, it's pretty devastating to see just concrete pads where camps used to be. The hospital in Cameron, where I had to have my arms sewed up just a few months ago after an accident in the marsh. They're open, they're operational, but the damage all around them is pretty extensive.
Larry, let me ask you a question here. I obviously my wife and I now live in Memphis, but nevertheless, our eyes were fixed on the Weather Channel, the news leading up to the landfall of Hurricane Laura, because we still have so many friends in that region that were under the gun, and we were really concerned about what was going to be happening. We came through Rita, we came through Ike. We know the potential damage that the storm surge that was talked about leading up to this could cause. And that was the big headline. That was the big headline coming into this. And as landfall occurred and the storm passed, you and I actually talked about this a bit offline. The headline once Laura passed was that the surge wasn't as bad, but you made the point that while that's true, the forecast were apocalyptic, and so when the damage is the surge wasn't as bad as forecast, it made people kind of think that it wasn't that bad, but that's not exactly true because it was still a catastrophic surge. The other thing that has kind of struck me with respect to this, Larry, just looking at pictures, is the damage from the wind. When I think back to Rita and Ike and the wind fields and wind strengths that were associated with them, I don't think they were anywhere near what Hurricane Laura brought. And I think people don't, at least based on the pictures that I'm seeing, and I want you to comment on this, I don't think people really appreciate that, or outside of Louisiana, how severe, although the surge might not have reached 20 feet as those dire predictions were, the surge was still bad, but the wind damage from what I've seen was just extraordinary. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, that's absolutely the case. One of the slightly demoralizing aspects of the response early on was that it wasn't as bad as predicted. And that has taken away a little bit of the national emphasis on how bad it really was. Because as you described, those apocalyptic predictions were not borne out, but the damage is still incredible. And it was indeed the wind. And the other thing we can't forget is that damage from the wind didn't stop in those coastal parishes of Cameron and Calcasieu. They've moved up. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries offices in Beauregard Parish, in Rapides Parish, far north in the state, are still closed because of all the wind damage, the downed trees, the power outages. The wind was incredible, 150 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour higher than Hurricane Rita when Laura came ashore. And that is the really awesome spectacle that I've seen in my time down there and during this aerial survey, is the power of that wind, the things that got moved without a storm surge. It's pretty incredible. You can tell by the lack of specificity in the comments that I'm making that I was largely overwhelmed by the scope and the severity of the damage in particular locations. At the same time, I was breathing a sigh of relief that the storm surge was far less than predicted. And one of the sources of inspiration I've taken over the last 2 weeks is that the vital infrastructure of our roads and bridges held up so much better to Hurricane Laura than they did to Hurricane Rita in Southwest Louisiana, such that it's made the response far more effective. The thousands of linemen and people that have come from all over the place to literally take a 3 or 4 county area with no power whatsoever and get us back up into some form of livability has been incredible. And one of the reasons that has been so successful is because the roads held up so much better, probably because of a better engineering and technology when we had to rebuild from Rita. So if I had to find one positive thing in everything that I saw, that was it.
Yeah. Well, that is, we'll take any silver lining that we can get at this point. But I wanted us to start this conversation by acknowledging the reality that, as you described, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps, I don't know what the actual number continues to be, that remain without power and that looking forward probably don't see power being restored to their place, if they're fortunate enough to still have an inhabitable house. Don't know when that power is going to be restored. And so we wanted to certainly mention that. Certainly within Ducks Unlimited, there are so many people, whether it be in our conservation staff, our fundraising staff, or just anyone, our volunteers, our members. South Louisiana is such an important place for waterfowl. It's an important place for waterfowl hunters. It's an important place for Ducks Unlimited members and the passion they bring to wetlands and waterfowl conservation. Everyone within our organization extends to the people of southwestern Louisiana our thoughts, our prayers. We're certainly, there's been a lot of efforts to help make donations to some of the recovery efforts that are going on, and we thank our members and our volunteers for being active in that regard, and also just an opportunity here to remind everyone else outside of Louisiana that, hey, this was a really significant event. The damage was extensive, and it's ongoing, and the recovery's going to take a while. So our thoughts, our prayers, our well wishes go out to all the people of southwestern Louisiana, and even into central Louisiana, as you described. The damage extended well up into that portion of the state as well. So thank you for that, for taking some time, Larry, to describe a bit of the damage that did occur and that continues to be seen on the ground there. And I think that part of the conversation is going to extend into this next segment, where we actually talk about the survey results, because the hurricane did have very significant impacts to waterfowl habitats as well. Some good, as you will kind of talk about. There are some silver linings here as well on the wetland front. But so this is a theme that is going to carry into this next part. But so here I will transition to the September Teal survey that you conducted. I believe it was September 8th and 9th. And I think the numbers were fairly encouraging. So I'm going to turn it over to you right now and let you describe what you found. There's no need to describe the methods that we use. We've covered this on previous episodes. People can go back and listen to those. But this is a survey-based estimate of the number of teal that may be occurring in Louisiana during the dates of the survey. So tell our listeners what you found during that survey, Larry.
Well, the results were actually kind of heartening. We have been receiving reports from the field since about mid-August of a surprising number of teal in the marsh, in the rice fields of central Louisiana at Catahoula Lake. And so I didn't know that this flight was going to be approved. As you know, we're still battling restrictions based on COVID-19. And the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries has done virtually no aerial work since late March. Our April model duck survey was canceled. And so when I submitted this flight request, I was really happy to see that my agency approved the request, and that was not changed when Hurricane Laura came ashore. And so we did the survey on schedule, as we would intend to do. And the estimate of 236,000 blue-winged teal from this survey is nearly twice of what we saw at the same time last year, and 4 times the number that we saw 2 years ago. So just on the basis of total blue-winged teal count, that's nothing but good news. It's higher than the 5-year average. It's even a little higher than the long-term average of 227,000 blue wings on this survey. And what was good about these estimates is that both in Southwest Louisiana and in Southeast Louisiana, the numbers were significantly higher than in the recent past. So it appears that there are more blue wings in the state now than there have been in recent years. And that's nothing but good news for teal hunters in the state, which will hit the field on September the 12th.
Yeah, Larry, I want to talk about the distribution of the teal, both from Southwest Louisiana, Southeast Louisiana, as well as the habitats where you found them. I think it's been a pattern here recently. You know historically more than I do, but there more teal have been surveyed in southwestern Louisiana than southeastern Louisiana. Was the pattern that you saw, the relative distribution of teal, similar this year to what we normally see, or was there more of a skew?
Between Southwest and Southeast Louisiana, the pattern was pretty much as we've come to expect. One of the reasons Southwest Louisiana is such a vital habitat for migrating and wintering waterfowl is the juxtaposition of the marsh to the agricultural regions. You have this complex of wetlands in that 3 or 4 parish area where the rice agriculture is adjacent to the coastal marsh. And every year when the blue wings start to show up in Louisiana, they typically show up in that region of the state, utilizing the rice agriculture. Typically this time of year, we've got decent water on the landscape because of the second crop rice agriculture, and that's typically where we see the large number of teal start to build up early in September. And so the distribution southwest to southeast across the coast was similar to what we expected. What we didn't expect was, well, I'm not going to say we didn't expect it because we all know what those storm impacts were in the coastal marsh of Southwest Louisiana. But we saw virtually no teal in the marsh from the Texas border all the way to the Atchafalaya Basin. We saw virtually no blue wings, very few mottled ducks, very few black-bellied whistling ducks. We saw very few ducks at all on the coastal marsh portions of those transects. But once we transitioned into the agricultural region, we started to see a lot more birds. A lot more birds to the point that the number of blue wings that we counted in Southwest Louisiana was 45% higher than the most recent 10-year average in that area. So not only were there more birds in the ag compared to the marsh, which is typical, but this year it was even more extreme. And the thing that really drove that point home to us flying the survey was mottled ducks. I mean, mottled ducks are, during the September survey, you fly a lot of miles, a lot of hours without seeing very many birds. I mean, typically our Our surveys are anywhere from 1.5 to 3 million birds. And this survey's total duck is 268,000. And it was an above average year. So this September survey is long, hot, arduous, without seeing a tremendous number of birds. But model ducks always keep you in the game, because as you're flying these coastal transects, you're constantly seeing a pair here, a small group there. That was not the case this year. We didn't see very many model ducks at all until we got into the ag. And then when we saw them in very large groups. And so that just reinforced the distribution that we were seeing from the other ducks as well.
And to kind of put a finer point on the reason for that distribution, no birds in the marsh, virtually all the birds that you counted being in that agricultural landscape in southwestern part of the state. It's because of that storm surge, but what that storm surge brings with it is some very high salinity water. Typically those coastal wetlands, I mean, obviously as you get closer to the coast, you expect those to be the salinity to increase, to become a bit more brackish. There's some infrastructure things that control the salinity within some of those units. We know that, but yes, typically those wetlands, the salinity in those coastal marshes is going to be fresh, intermediate into the brackish range. But that surge basically dumps ocean water, Gulf water, sea strength salt water into those wetlands, and it creates situations that are not conducive to the production and growth of waterfowl foods. Most waterfowl dabbling ducks that we see in coastal Louisiana do not like salt water. And so, you started out by saying what we didn't expect. Historically, that's not what we expect, is what you're describing. But once you know how those storm surges operate in terms of dumping all that salt water in there, it probably didn't surprise you to not see any ducks in the marsh now. Now, a couple of other things, Larry, and I know you referenced this in your report. Whenever we get a surge of salt water, whether from a tropical storm or through some controlled introduction of salt water through, let's say, the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway into a management unit, that can bring with it some benefits in terms of controlling, setting back what has become a really significant problem in coastal wetlands of Louisiana, that being invasive aquatic vegetation. Talk about what you saw with regard to saltwater impacts on that.
It's not just saltwater as well, Mike, because what you say is absolutely correct. Blue-winged teal are birds that like shallower, flooded wetlands. And so along with that saltwater comes high water and lots of debris. There are many drainages that are currently blocked right now with, what we call rack lines, just 8 to 10 foot high stacks of debris, of rosocane that's been blown everywhere. At the rack line very near where I hunt, near the town of Creole, I was up in that rack last Saturday, and there are huge balls of water hyacinth and giant salvinia wrapped up into those acres and acres of debris. But they have also blocked 3 very important drainages to that large area. That's actually a project area from a NACA grant that the Gulf Coast Joint Venture helped fund and Ducks Unlimited helped construct a number of years ago. And those drainages are blocked, which elevates the water level. Where I was in the marsh, it's typically below knee deep, and it was up to the middle of my chest. So we not only have salinity, but we have high water, and we have blocked drainages that's going to keep that higher salinity, higher water levels in place for an extended period of time. So not only does it inhibit, now we're talking short term, it really compromises the habitat quality for waterfowl, especially species that favor shallow habitats like blue-winged teal. On the short term, this storm surge and everything that comes with it has greatly compromised the short-term habitat quality out there. And that is the fundamental reason that so few teal, mottled ducks, black-bellied whistling ducks were seen on the coastal marsh portions of these transects, and instead we encountered them in the agricultural region. But now we've laid out the doom and gloom, but it's short term. Long term, a number of places in the state, and you're right, I referenced them in the report. If you look back at, say, last September's report, you'll see that I wrote about important wintering habitats in Southwest Louisiana that were literally covered with water hyacinth or giant salvinia. I talked about those invasive aquatics reducing the habitat quality. You cannot find those invasive aquatics today. They have either been blown away, or they have been balled up in the debris rack lines, or they have been killed by the salinity in the storm surge. There has been a big positive effect on invasive aquatics. And it also tends to do some scouring and open up ponds, increasing the sort of marsh to open water ratio in areas where the marsh was closing in. That salt water and the scouring activity of that storm surge will have a beneficial impact on the interspersion of habitats in the marsh. And we can expect, and I say we can expect that because we saw this after Hurricane Rita in 2005. We saw it after Hurricane Ike in 2008. And so I'm hopeful that we will see some beneficial habitat-based impacts of this storm event for all of the bad things it's doing to everything else. We should see some positive benefits in the coming years.
Larry, I remember seeing that after Rita, and I actually have some pictures where going down one of the highways there, is it Highway 82, or is it Highway 82 there that leads to Rockefeller?
That's right.
I stopped along that road and took a picture out and across one of the marshes where a few months prior, or maybe a month prior, I had gone down there, and it was thick with rosocane and other robust vegetation. And then I guess it would have been the growing season after Rita. And it looked like an intensively managed moist soil unit, the millets, the foxtails, the smartweeds that were growing out in what had become that, fresh marsh, shallow fresh marsh at that point. It looked fantastic. And of course, you give it an additional 5 or 6 years and it returned to that more robust, less productive from a waterfowl food standpoint condition. And so, yes, I've seen that, and most other people that live in South Louisiana have probably seen that as a result of some of those storms. And of course, those invasive aquatics have very low tolerance for saline water, and so that salt water does burn them and kind of kill them, and that's good to hear because I've seen some of that stuff firsthand myself. Larry, the other thing, of course, that the conditions as they currently are, high water, blocked drainages, that it's going to do is it's going to make it much more difficult for a lot of hunters to, even if they wanted to give it a shot, it's going to make it much more difficult for them to access some of their hunting locations. So it's like rubbing salt in an already gaping wound, that even if they had time to get out there, there may not be any point in it given the water levels that you've described. But even if they happen to be in an area where the water levels were low, the access to some of those areas is going to be greatly reduced, at least right now. Do you expect much waterfowl hunting in southwestern Louisiana here in the early teal season in the marshes? I
believe that it'll be much reduced. We already know that a couple of large, traditional, legendary hunting clubs in southwest Louisiana will not open for the hunting season. A lot of those lodges have been damaged. A lot of the hunting in southwest Louisiana has a long traditional heritage with camps, lodges, guide services associated with them. And in fact, Oak Grove Hunting Club will not open for hunting this year, primarily because all of their guides and most of their staff are either homeless or their homes have really been compromised by storm impacts. Impact from the rack lines, from those block drainages. There's definitely going to be some difficulty in accessing certain parts of the marsh. But these guys are resilient, Mike. I've lived a lot of places and traveled a lot in my work. There is not a more resilient group of people than these folks in Southwest Louisiana. And a lot of the marsh it's deep. It's not going to be really good habitat for the birds. But they also know there's at least a couple 100,000 blue wings. We all know there's a lot more than that. Just north of them in the ag, the guys are going to be after with a vengeance when the season opens. And so there are going to be people in the marsh. We know the effort's going to be greatly reduced, but I don't think you'll have too much trouble finding a duck hunter when the teal season opens.
That's good. I'm sure you will hear many times down there here over the next couple of weeks. You can't kill them on the couch. You got to be out in the marsh. So, Larry, talking about the opportunities for hunting and the number of teal that you observed in the agricultural landscape there, and kind of working our way on up to Catahoula Lake, during your surveys, maybe on the transects or even off transects sometime, did you see much additional shallow habitat in, let's say, pastures or other non-rice fields that might have occurred, been left as a result of the rains from Hurricane Laura? Is there some of that out there on the landscape for people to take advantage of?
You know, Mike, this is where I'm going to sound a lot like the national media. Not as much as I expected to see. I expected to see water everywhere, lots of sheet flooding everywhere I went, and only in a couple of locations. There is definitely above average shallow flooding in the agricultural landscape compared to normal, but it's not what I expected. Most of the water out there is managed water. It's in rice agriculture. It wasn't as widespread as I expected. Now, that's a highly biased statement because we don't collect data on wetland availability as we're flying these transects like they do on the BPOP survey up north or on the North Dakota breeding population ground survey. So what you're getting is my perspective, which is why that ends up in the comments section rather than a data table. I and the rest of the crew were impressed with the fact that the flooding was not that extensive in the agricultural regions. And that's kind of consistent with what this storm did, that it wasn't the rainfall. The storm surge was less than expected. It was the wind that really did the damage. And so we're in good shape. Don't get me wrong. That habitat, as I said, is in above average condition, but it wasn't as extensive as we expected.
Interesting. Larry, that's probably going to wrap it up for us here. I appreciate you taking the time to share these insights with us. Anything else that you want to leave our listeners with? You know, the one thing before I turn it over to you for that, the one thing that I have to say, I would be remiss and I would regret it if I overlooked this, and I don't mean to in any way. We talk about the impacts from the hurricane to the residents and property and livelihoods of people in southwestern Louisiana. We can't forget about our comrades, our partners, our friends and family in southeastern Texas as well. They ended up on the western side of the storm. That granted, if you're going to be in the zone of landfall for a tropical storm, you want to be on the west side of that eye, and that's kind of where they ended up being. So the damages they incurred were not as severe as they could have been, but nevertheless, they didn't come out of this unscathed either. And so we want to make sure we acknowledge the effects that they were facing as well. So, so yes, acknowledge the people out in southeastern Texas as well. We don't want to forget about them. But anything that you want to leave our listeners with, Larry, with respect to what you saw or what we might expect going forward?
I'd like to talk a little bit about Catahoula Lake. Catahoula Lake is one of the most important early season wetland habitats, both for migrating shorebirds which come through in big numbers around mid-August, but also for early season waterfowl like teal and pintails. And this year we counted 18,000 blue wings on Catahoula Lake. More evidence that the rainfall wasn't as big an issue as we feared it would be. The lake is still within management targets. We try to keep it between 26.5 and 27.5 during this drawdown phase. When we flew the survey, it was at 27.2. There was some shallow flooding over a large portion of the lake. It was excellent habitat for blue wings. Those 18,000 blue wings were the highest that we've counted since 2012. It was much higher than the last few years. And so everything really looks good at Catahoula Lake. The vegetation looked pretty good as long as we can maintain the water within those management targets. And so again, another piece of evidence that we've got more blue wings in the state this year than we've had in recent years. And Catahoula Lake, of course, is going to be more accessible to hunters than those in Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Louisiana. Although the storm impacts were mild, in fact, almost non-existent in most of the places we flew, the habitat conditions there are about average over most of it. But down at the mouth of the river, there was definitely an increase in Delta duck potato production. There was extensive SAVs, and this year there were broad flats of southern wild rice. I've been informed by our staff down there that when conditions are such that we get these nice flats of Zizaniopsis aquatica, that's the place that you want to be for teal. And of course, that's where we counted the majority of the teal on this particular survey. So I know our focus is appropriately fixed on Southwest Louisiana, but we saw pretty good things in Southeast Louisiana and at Catahoula Lake as well.
That's good to hear. Hunters and outdoor lovers in Louisiana will take every bit of good news that they can get right now. This has been a very difficult year in so many respects. The latest blow being one of the most significant. But yes, thank you for bringing a bit of good news with respect to the number of teal. That is certainly an uplifting piece of information compared to the past couple of years. And so good luck to all the hunters that are out there in the early teal season, finding some of these birds and taking advantage of what is a wonderful resource and a wonderful place to pursue these birds. And so, Larry, I don't know if you're going to be able to get out at all, knowing the impacts on your lease, but if you are able to, best of luck to you. And again, on behalf of everyone at Ducks Unlimited, we extend our thoughts, prayers, and well wishes to everyone affected by the storms throughout Louisiana, southeastern Texas. And as you said, Larry, they are an incredibly resilient bunch. That we know that they will rebuild, they will recover, and we'll get back to normal. And as soon as we can. It's a long road ahead, but we'll get there. Any final comments, Larry?
I hope this good news manifests itself into good hunting success for those that are able to get out and get after them. Otherwise, I echo your sentiments, Mike. Thank you very much.
A very special thanks to our guest on today's show and frequent guest of the show, good friend of mine, Larry Reynolds with Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. We greatly appreciate him taking the time to share with us insights from South Louisiana, what he saw in terms of teal numbers, as well as the damage that was wrought by Hurricane Laura as it made landfall a couple of weeks ago. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great work that he does. And of course, you, the listeners, you're the most important part of this effort. We thank you for spending your time with us, supporting the podcast, and we thank you for your commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.